Hi, this is Dr. Bourne, and I'm coming to you today talking a little bit about church growth history and research on church growth and why some churches rise, why they decline. You saw when you did some research, seeing the changing demographics over time. And so, for us as social scientists, and for you as beginning scholars in the study of religion in America, we start trying to understand like why might this happen? Why might some churches grow, some decline? Why do people switch denominations? Why are some of the rise? Why are some of the decline? And it's because it helps us understand the nature of religion in the United States, and also like even within a particular denomination. So like within Christianity. So there's a lot of fluctuation within Christianity, as opposed to people moving from like Christianity to Hinduism. So there's even a lot of fluctuation within that denomination, that Christian denominations. And so it's important for us to understand why might that be. And so I just want to walk you through a couple of theories here. We have the reading here by Kenneth Inskeep, a short history of church growth research that really kind of lays out a really, really high level. And then during this, I'm going to jump into a more detailed assessment. I don't think the article, because it's trying to do so much broad assessment, I'm going to jump over to a PowerPoint and show you a little bit about Kelly's thesis on strictness theory. Go into a little bit more detail about that, but first, right at the outset, I'm really just going to kind of talk through this article and kind of hit some key notes. But really, the thing that is the larger theories here that are really in play are these two approaches to take, which trying to understand church growth. And so, let's take a step back. We have two parties or two groups of people that are working in church growth. The first would be your academics. The academics right here, studies in mainline denomination of professional social scientists or academics, trying to work within the academic communities, trying to say, okay, this is why church growth happens from a social scientific point of view. And then there's another population, and these would be the pastors. The pastors, maybe sometimes largely conservative Protestant church professionals, who began studying church growth out of they wanted to grow their own churches, and so it's more of a how do I grow my church? I'm starting a church. I'm the pastor of a church. How do I grow it? And so that's based more on anecdotal stories and evidence. So, but we'll make those distinctions sort of like as you walk through the article. Now, when we're talking about church growth, there's two major approaches in sort of like understanding the trends or church growth. And so this first one is this notion of what are called contextual factors. And contextual factors they're external to the theology of the church itself. So say, if you're building a church in a suburb of Raleigh, you're in an area of population boom versus in downtown Cleveland, Ohio. Okay, so I mean, where you're building your church, the birth rate of a particular area, the fluency of a particular area, the race or gender makeup, or the age demographics. If you're building a church in a retirement region of the United States, for example, and so is the population increasing, decreasing? I mean, that's one way of really saying, okay, the context itself. That's one very particular important one. Is like, okay, is the population growing or decreasing? So let's take Catholic churches, for example. Catholic churches, where my sister lives up in the Bronx, New York, Catholic churches and Catholic schools are shutting down. Where my in-laws retired a while back, south of Wilmington, in the Diocese of Raleigh, south of Wilmington, I mean, Catholic churches are booming, and they're all going through capital campaigns. They're overflowing, but that's part of this just demographic shift of people moving from the north to the south, especially Catholics. But I can go into more detail on that later on. So you have your contextual factors, rising birth rates, as noted here. So, but there's also something called institutional factors. Now, institutional factors are things sort of like within the denomination can control or the church can control. And so if we're talking about a level of strictness or a particular conservative theology of a church, those are institutional factors, or even the pastor's dynamism and ability to communicate. These are all things that institutions can do that they can control. And so those are really sort of like the two largest categories of things that impact church growth. So if we're moving to the next page and we're looking at, okay, so stepping all the way back, the Kelly thesis, when he wrote a book in 1972, and he wrote this book, it's like, why talking about conservative religions, and so why conservative churches are growing. And he originally didn't want the title of why conservative churches are growing. He actually wanted the title why strong churches are growing. But his editor forced him into, and he's always regretted that. And so getting into this idea, okay, like what is a strong church, or what is a strict church, or what is a conservative church? And so what he did, like, now granted, this is back in 1972, but other theorists have picked up this argument, and other theorists have tried to disprove this particular argument. And so it really is like this, kind of like a catalyst in the field of church growth research. But he's a sociologist, and he really is trying to argue. He has a title chapter, Traits of a Strong Religion. He's talking about those who are accustomed to the placid and circumspect ways of the mainline Protestant denominations in America today may not think of religion as a strenuous and fateful adventure, catching up on men's lives in a surge of significance and purpose, changing the very definition of what it is to be a man worthy of respect, and the shifting upward of a whole society's expectation of human behavior. But religion has often been this kind of movement in the past and will be in the future. So then when he goes into like a particular kind of strong religion or a strict religion, essentially it gets into, and I'm going to jump to another screen really quick. We can have this understanding of what's called like strictness theory. Okay? And so strictness theory, it's a really important theory, and you're going to hear a little bit about it from Larry Iannacone on the audio recording on the podcast. But really what it argues is like first laying out, I'm going to go through this quickly, but first laying out this idea of like we're in a religious marketplace. And so that's one aspect, is that we're in a religious marketplace. So everyone has a freedom of religion. It's not just one particular religion propped up by the state. So we're not Germany, where the Lutheran Church gets state funding. So a free market means like every religion is competing with one another. And they're competing for your soul. They're competing for your money, your time, your energy, your effort. Okay. And so while they do that, and so we can start thinking about religions as being suppliers. And suppliers of things that we want. So there's a religious demand among the people, and in the United States there is a relatively constant demand for religion. Now, how that religion is perceived is a little bit different, especially over the last 30 years or so. But there is demand. People still want religion, and so how do they want it? Well, religious suppliers will have to figure that out and meet. How are they supplying their religious ideology? And you see innovation going on. You see these mega churches that also have Starbucks in them, or they say one church up in Chicago, Willow Creek, I think, has $1 million donut budget. I mean, that's how big it is. These churches are 40,000 people strong. Now when you have a pandemic, how big are they? They're not that big. But that's why they want to get people back in the pews. And so you have a lot of things. You'll have bands, you'll have coffee shops, you'll have leagues, you'll have gyms there. So a lot of these churches are innovating and trying to meet things. So, but all of this is based on this idea that we make religious decisions freely. So what we do is we see, okay, what is the perceived cost of participating in a particular religion, and what's the perceived benefit? Now, for religions, you have salvation, or immortality, or depending upon your religion, you might reach nirvana, or if you're a Viking, maybe you'll go to Valhalla. So there's a benefit, but oftentimes it's an unknown, lingering benefit, something that's not immediately known. There are also tangential benefits of being part of a community, expanding your network. There are great benefits in participating in a religion and religious communities, but there's a cost there. There's an opportunity cost. You could be doing something else. Oftentimes there's a financial cost. You have to pay, especially if you're Jewish, you have to pay to get your tickets to be able to go for the high holy days. There's oftentimes like an opportunity cost for dietary restrictions or behavior restrictions, adultery. Not supposed to be doing that. Or if you're a Catholic during Lent, you're not supposed to be eating meat on Friday. So there's a cost for all of this. But the idea, and this is an economic idea, is that the benefit outweighs the cost. That's why we're willing to do it. But that being religious is a rational decision. And so part of this is called rational choice theory. So I'm running through this, and we might circle back to this later in this semester. But all of this is setting up this idea of strictness versus permissiveness. And this is where we get back into Kelly's thesis of strictness versus permissiveness. And so more demands placed on believers to a point equals more committed members. And so think about it, if you're playing an instrument, the more time you put into something and the more demands you place, the better of a trumpet player you're going to be. The more demands you place on a team, if you have them practice more often, you have them come, you have them work hard, you're going to have a better team. And so the more demands you place on believers up to a point, you're going to have more committed members. Because what it does is it makes it a line in the sand of like, okay, who is in and who is out. So the theory is that strict churches within limits are stronger than permissive ones. And so if you don't require attendance, you say, sure, come whenever you want to come, don't come, we don't care. Or if you don't require tithing or giving money to the church, it's like, sure, give us money, don't give us money. So they won't. And also you have like a little pithy question here of like, who wants to eat in a restaurant with no cars in the parking lot? Now, again, we're talking about churches not having members actually in the pews. It's a little bit different. But for, go back in time when people ate in restaurants, you don't want to eat in a restaurant where there weren't any cars in the parking lot. Who wants to go there? And so the success strictness, how does this happen? And so, well, with this idea is that religion is collectively produced. And so people, think of a concert or think of a movie theater. Think of going to a comedy in a movie theater. Since you're surrounded by people laughing, and so you're laughing too. It amplifies the experience you're having. It's the same thing when there's a lot of people in the pews or in a particular religious congregation. If they're singing, it is collectively produced. We're all contributing to it, and so the greater that we are all contributing, the more we all get out of it. And so plus it has this notion, this feedback loop of like, if all of these other people are committed to saying the creed, for example, then I need to be saying the creed too, to be part of this particular religion. So you have this sort of cyclical impact of where the more I contribute, more other people are getting out of it. The more other people contribute, I'm getting more out of it. And so really it's like the more I put in, the more I get out. And you can see that in other social situations as well. You also have like with religious capital or investments, like I'm investing all this time, energy, behavior, and the more committed members are less likely to convert. And so what I'm doing is like by being committed to this particular religion, I'm investing in it. And so I'm not willing necessarily to leave. If you spent your whole childhood playing the saxophone, when you grow up, unless you have some sort of some sort of crisis, you're not going to move to the flute. It's like you've been playing the saxophone, you've invested all this time, you've gotten really good at it. Much like with a particular sport, you're not going to give it up. So, and so what all of this is, what it's trying to do by making this strict, what you're doing is you're ridding the group of moochers, or what are technologically called free riders. Okay, and so what you're saying is you're either in or you're out. You're excluding the lukewarm members. And so you're doing addition by subtraction. And so it heightens the average level of commitment. It's like, if you are going to be part of this religion, you have to come to Bible study on Tuesday. If you're going to be part of this particular religion, you have to not drink caffeine. The Mormons don't have caffeine. So if you're going to be part of this particular religion, you have to give up pork. So Muslims don't eat pork. And so what you're trying to do is you're trying to make sure that when people are in, that they're in. And so you're drawing a line in the sand saying, okay, if you're going to be in, you're going to be all in, because we're all committed to this. Again, think of a team, think of a travel team versus a rec team. A travel team, everyone needs to be committed to it in order for it to be successful. You can't be having these like, oh, you can't miss this practice, this tournament, so-and-so. It has to mean a lot to you. And when it means a lot to everybody, you get this constant reinforcement that this does mean a lot to people, and so it should mean a lot to me. And what you're also doing is you're limiting out-group activities and socialization. And so essentially, you can create your social nexus around this religious grouping. And the value, despite it being so, despite this religion being expensive, this is Kelly's whole central thesis, is despite it being expensive, despite it being strict or strong, these religions offer greater value to the individual. So that's in crux the thesis of strictness. Strictness equals stronger churches. This is some selections from Rodney Stark. All exclusive religious organizations conceive of a dependable God of great scope who is capable of providing otherworldly rewards. But it's really the idea is that you get more out of it because the expectations are higher. They are strict. So that's really this notion of strictness, and there's a lot of research on this. I mean, you have retention rates go up if they're stricter. And you'll pick some of this up in the conversation with Larry Anconi in the podcast. But Larry did some research on distinctiveness versus attendance, and so you can see here in this chart that those religions that are the most strict, Mormons, Jehovah's Witness, and Seventh-day Adventists, and so the proxy of measuring success is church attendance. And these are nationalized samples, but Mormons and Jehovah's Witnesses and Seventh-day Adventists are some of the most strict religious organizations around, and they have the highest attendance rate of services per year. So the ones that are not very strict, the Unitarian Universalists, the Episcopalians, United Church of Christ, the Methodists, Presbyterians, they're not very distinctive, and so they're measuring distinctiveness as strictness. And so it's like how unique are the demands placed on these members? What kind of demands are placed on these members? And Catholics kind of like coming right in the middle. So, but it's really Larry goes on and he follows up with 2 decades later is continuing on with Kelly's thesis and tweaks it a little bit. But you'll pick that up in the podcast. So bouncing back to this. So we kind of covered the Kelly thesis. Now there's another thesis looking here. Bibby's thesis, our original Bibby. He's one of the first of the social scientists to dispute the conservative versus liberal hypothesis. So, with Kelly's book, Why Conservative Churches Are Growing, Bibby comes up and questions that. So he argues instead this is where you start having this idea of contextual factors coming in. So Kelly would find out what he would kind of like fall on the institutional factors, like how strong or how strict a particular religion is. That's up to the institution. Bibby comes along, it's like, no, actually contextual factors are more important. And really it's just simply birth rate. Birth rates are more important to church growth than any other institutional factor, including conservative theology in explaining church growth. So he's like, okay, so what's most important here is the first thing, you have birth rate, and so you have replacement rate. Evangelical Christians tend to have a higher birth rate than mainline Christians, and so your conservative evangelicals tend to have a higher birth rate than, say, your Methodists. And that's just, and those are just demographic shifts. Those are contextual factors. Now, what's also important there is something that the institution can do, but at the very grounding, you have a higher birth rate. Now, what the institution can do is they can socialize. And so the socialization of the youth is crucial for keeping members in that religious tradition. And so if you look right here, he noted 65% of the mainline affiliates were exposed regularly to Christian education in childhood, but less than 30% of mainline affiliates with children were seeing to it that their children had a similar experience. And so what's happening is like these people, these 65% who were socialized into their church, only 30% are actually doing it for their children. And so when you're not socializing the youth into that religious organization, you're not creating the language, you're not creating the experiences to keep them in that particular religious tradition when they grow up. And so many of you, like your parents might have been brought up in a religion, or you were brought up in a religion, but then it kind of dwindled over time. And so if you're not brought up into a particular religion, the chances of you going to that particular religion are very low. So if you're not socialized in, if you're not going to Bible study, or you're not getting baptized, or in the Catholic Church, you're not going to confirmation, if there's no reaffirmation of these religious beliefs, what we find is the next generation, obviously you're going to have people that are disaffected. That even if they self-identify as that particular religious tradition, they're not going to church. They're not doing religiously commitment things. So, so the strict institutional demands, can fend off losses, but not produce gains. So that means like if you can do some of these strictness things, you can fend off the losses of the church. But what Balma, who came after Bibby, is arguing that it's not making up. You're not getting new members. You're just keeping some of the members from falling by the wayside. So in this sense, it's a little bit of contextual. The contextual factor being the birth rate. The institutional factor playing the key role is the socialization. So and rearing people up in those particular religious traditions. So Hoagie and Rusin, Dean Hoagie and Rusin, David Rusin, they pretty much wanted to outline the whole thing. But what they did is like they really kind of tried to like lay out what are the institutional factors and what are the contextual factors. They're trying to really kind of like outline both of them and really question Kelly's thesis about strictness and institutional factors, and then others such as Bibby, who are focusing more on the contextual factors. So if we scroll to the next page, one of their hypotheses was considering 5 church goals: numerical growth, level of individuals' religious commitment, levels of members' satisfaction and enthusiasm, level of love and care, so forth and so on. They're not mutually exclusive, and they do not form a fixed sum system. So what that's their hypothesis. That they're trying to find. They're trying to determine. And so what they find down here, despite the contextual qualification proposed for the institutional hypothesis, both contextual and institutional factors emerged as important in this study. Okay. So what are these? Okay. So the first contextual factor is affluence of the community surrounding the congregation and favorable demographic shifts. These were the 2 most important contextual factors that were coming into play. So affluence and demographic shifts. And so if you're going to start a new church, where are you going to do it? And later on, it talks in the article about having it easily accessible by a highway or by main roads. Okay, so, but those are focusing on these contextual factors with the affluence. Okay, but there's also something institutional. And so the role of the pastor is not particularly important, but what is important to them is that churches that grow are able to generate high levels of membership satisfaction. Okay, so then you got to think about, okay, what are the things that provide or contribute to high levels of membership satisfaction? It's focusing on the membership. It's making them want to be there. And then that's where you can start getting into, making sure everybody's there, making sure everyone's participating. So you can do things on the strictness side that impact the membership satisfaction, and focusing on them. So in any case, so clear for them that it was both institutional and contextual factors were important in understanding church growth. So it's not really answering any questions there. They both are important, but they really do delineate between, and they're the ones. The first was like, okay, let's try to measure these against one another. We're really not coming up with something first, but let's outline the institutional factors that could play in, such as strictness or the impact of the pastor, versus the contextual factors such as affluence of the region and demographic shifts. So after Hoagie and Rosen, the central role of context. This is where we start really kind of shifting into the contextual approach. How do I emphasize the dominant impact of population change for growth? And so that was really, they found down here that they found congregations grew, and they were in affluent, middle class, largely white residential neighborhoods with high percentage of home ownership and few other Protestant churches as competitors. Okay. So again, you're talking about some of the biggest contextual factors, because they're not looking at what the church itself does, not like the theology of the church. And so they argued the context. So it's not as if institutional factors were not completely unaccounted for, but the context accounted for between half and almost 3/4 of the explained variance in growth, while institutional variables accounted for 30 to 50%. So really, it's kind of moving away. The idea is like here it's moving away from Kelly's thesis of the strictness theory. And it wasn't until Larry Iannacone comes back in like 1992 as like really rehashes this. And then another reading that you have later on, Mark Chavez, who's over at Duke, he actually argues that at no point in time is it conservative or is it strictness. And so you get a lot of different theories to kind of work through here. But really, the most important thing is really noting that there are the institutional factors and the contextual factors playing in here. So you also down here, another study found that Kelly's thesis appears to have explanatory value in accounting for members and offering retention. Okay, and so it's they're being retained, but not necessarily getting new members. Okay, so that's another little wrinkle. So these are all the sociologists that are arguing. Okay, why does church growth happen? You can see they're kind of all over the place. They're still, even to this day, arguing with one another. And then we throw in the shift to the spiritual but not religious, the rise of religious nuns, and it complicates it even more. We'll get to that. But these are all the sociologists, the academics. They're arguing with one another, looking at survey data, doing their own surveys. But now we're shifting. Okay, well, what about the pastors? I mean, the pastors don't really care. They don't read the academic work. They don't really care. They just want to grow their church. They just want to spread the gospel. They just want to go out there and let the Holy Spirit take over and let it grow. And so here's where you have the church growth movement among pastors, and this is where it's much more anecdotal and not really social science driven. Donna McGavran kind of credited founding this church growth movement, but really just interested in church growth, not for scientific reasons, but because they wanted converts. They wanted converts to the Christian faith. So he doesn't really care about the context. He's like, it's like don't let the context pull you down, because really, the salvation of souls and nothing else is really the key of what he's trying to accomplish. And for him, it's along the lines of the socialization approach, but I mean, he actually uses indoctrination as an effective church growth technique. And so you have to get your youth involved. You have to get them involved in the church, and you have to get them involved not just in the religious aspect of the church, but you have to have them playing in the sports leagues. You have to have them going to the social events, parties on Friday nights, watching movies at the church, all of these things. Like, you get them into the life of the church. And then what it does, if we go back to this cost benefit ratio, is like they're less willing to leave because all of their friends are there. Everyone they know is there. They're comfortable there. They know the religion. They know when to sit, when to stand. They know the songs. They're a part of the band. They learn the instruments there. They know the pastor. They know the teachers. They know their Bible study group. And so they're less willing to leave. And so you have this indoctrination is a really powerful word, but sociologists will call it socialization. And he goes through, but focus also on, it's not just about keeping your youth, but it's also about conversions. And so he's saying like there's 12 reasons, emphasize the context of mission work. The conversions, he argued, were the result of the right message being in the right place at the right time, as well as the willingness to abandon old techniques and experiment with new. Okay, so there are actually institutional things that the church can do. And again, you can see this is back in 1970. So this has been a long, and there's more recent studies, obviously, more recent approaches. But this argument has been going on for a while. So this is just five of the 12. So, but really, it's like focus gave credit to the Spirit of God when he referred to praying Christians filled with the Holy Spirit. But it's really the pastor can do a lot in this approach, but also it's anecdotal, because what ends up happening is McGavran will write a book, but he's in one context and it's not going to work for another context. And so that's the issue with this whole church growth movement among the pastors. So we have another recent example. Now we're up to like 1987. And a lot of these theories are still applied today. But this is actually this approach for Hunter is shared by social scientists, as they argue that it works. So it's the most successful strategies for achieving church growth was to use the existing social networks of current people. And so he referred to them as bridges of God, borrowed from McGavran. But sociologists call it, it's like you have this previously established social and familial networks. So essentially, think of Facebook. You have, and it's actually, there's the sampling method called snowball sampling that can be used on Facebook. And so, you invite one friend, your friend so you invite three friends, your friend invites three friends, or each one of those three friends invites three friends. And so now you're exponentially increasing the number of people that you're invited to come to church with you. So, and what happens is that because people are familiar with you, they're willing to go to the church because of you, and they trust you. And so it'll grow, the churches can grow through these existing social networks. So you might have had someone ask you to go to church with you. You might have asked someone to go to church with you, but it's someone It's not standing on the street corner, spouting it out from a soapbox. That is not the approach that you will take in growing a church. It's ineffective. And so, but really, this is the most effective way, and other sociologists have come along later on to really dissect that approach. But really, it's most people become members of the congregation through their personal contacts with other people who are already members. And so that's another thing. It's like it's not just the theology that's convincing them; it's that they want to be with those people. They were invited to go play basketball. They were invited to a movie night. They're invited to go get coffee. They're invited to go do something there. And so it works through these social networks and not just the theology. It's like, oh yes, I really want to be a conservative Christian. It's like, no, it's actually that comes secondary. So this is what Hunter offers. Like, here's what you should do. He actually provides a prescriptive approach to doing this, to using social networks. So it's really, really fascinating. And then these are some of the outcomes that he observed, but some of them are demonstrated by sociologists as well. Yes, effective faith sharing is more relational than verbal. Yes. Conversion is almost never instant, but it takes some weeks or months. Yes. Yes, that typically happens as well. You don't have these sort of bolt of lightning conversions that really happen. And often people are converted not necessarily by the message itself, but by the experience. And then the message kind of comes along with it. So, but really focusing this on, and so what happened is with this approach with Hunter, it started moving to a consumer-oriented approach, and they started doing market research, and they really started using marketing principles, and that's where we are today with the church movement on this aspect, on the pastor side, is really embracing a lot of branding. There's a lot of books on church branding, on messaging, on especially with social media, digital media. Making sure that they have messaging out there. I mean, really sophisticated, using Twitter, Instagram, the Gram, whatever other social media. I'm sure they're using TikTok now. So there's even some virtual churches, but really consciously applying marketing principles you have down here to the notion of evangelism. So, and these down here, these are actually these are marketing steps. These are not necessarily theological development steps. These are marketing steps. So. And so then finally we have Schaller, comes along, and he was actually a city planner or an urban planner, and so he knows how context plays into this. So he comes down here. Here's the key. For example, he argues that growth keeps the goals of a congregation focused by encouraging the congregation to look beyond taking care of the in-group of members and reaching out to serving the needs of the community. And so instead of always looking inward and being insular, it's constantly looking, okay, what is this new generation of churchgoers, and how do we appeal to them? And so this is where it's like, it gets a little tricky, because is the message changing, or is it just the mode? And some people argue that the message is changing too. And so that really plays into some negative connotations, like, oh, you're just pandering. But there's this drive to innovate. And so that gets back to, again, so sort of a full circle back with Kelly's thesis and Schaller's approach, to where, yes, it is contextual to one sense, but it's also institutional in the sense that there are things they need to do. And in innovating and asking a lot of their members, getting rid of free riders, all of these things. Again, if you're coming into a church and you see everyone around you is fully committed to this church, if you're not willing to fully commit, you're not going to be a member. And so what it does is it drives that average level of commitment up, which makes for a strong church. And so the growing church is driven by the needs of unchurched people rather than the needs of its own members. This is not necessarily proven, but this is the mode of the marketing approach. Is caring less about its own members than new members, and there's some issues with that, but we won't necessarily dive that deeply into the weeds about this. So discussions and conclusions. I mean, really, it's it's the idea is like you have two approaches. You have sociologists and academics kind of like taking a stab at it and doing more survey and research data. And then you have the anecdotal approach of pastors themselves or church marketers. You can even get a certification in church marketing. But really, it's the idea being that there's contextual factors and institutional factors that play into church growth. And usually, it's always a combination of both. It's clear that congregations cannot control their context, but they can control their relation to their context. And so if you're in a certain environment, if you're in the South, don't have a theology for the Northeast. Or if you're in a suburban area, understand who your clientele might be. Make sure that you have easy access to be able to come in. And so there are things you can do on the institutional side that really heighten and really can take great advantage of the contextual factors that play in. So some of the problems are really, it's just the pastors, for mainline pastors, as church leaders, is like, a slow reaction time. Sometimes slow reaction time, things are changing, things are shifting, and they're unwilling to do it. The Catholic Church, for example, had been relatively slow. That's a different animal. But really, there are things that you can do, or that pastors can do, to grow their churches, even if they could even embrace the sociological understanding of it. But that's a summary of this article. You could reading it yourself and a little bit deeper dive into the strictness theory. But hopefully this was help elucidate and give you a better understanding of why some churches grow in the United States, why some churches decline, and better understand the church around the corner. So with that, thanks so much for your time. If you have any questions, please let me know.